Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we have a great show for you this evening. We have, first of all, Alejandro Rojas is going to be joining us for some UFO updates. Then we have Stephen Bassett, and he's going to be talking about something he is up to in Washington, D.C., and we'll be talking all about that. I have a special connection with Steve Bassett because, as you know, for long-time listeners, I have 370 some odd shows up, and Stephen Bassett was show number one. I reached out to a number of people when I wanted to start this podcast, and no one paid attention to me, and Stephen said, sure, I'll be on your show, no problem. So I always have, like I said, a special place in my heart for Steve Bassett, and he's welcome on my show anytime, and he'll be coming up right after the news. We do have a blog as usual over at podcastufo.com. I'll tell you that in just a second, but you can also go over there if you would like to support the show. And do check out the weekly blogs that we have posted there by Charles Lear. He does a great job. And this one was one I had actually never heard of before. It's called the Zanfretta UFO case in Italy, and so it's really interesting, and check that out. And I think that might be it. I want to thank Peggy that helps me over at the Facebook page. Check that out. We have new stories up there every single day, not always on the weekend, but sometimes, and so check that out over there. I guess that's enough for me. Alejandro, how are you?
I'm doing well. I actually have my good mic set up, so I'm not doing, just the laptop camera and the Apple ear sets anymore. So hopefully
yes,
the sound and video is better for you all.
Yeah, and are you in a new location?
I am.
Yeah. That's all you're going to say about that.
That's all I got to say about that.
It's west of here in Maine. That's all we'll say, in an undisclosed location.
Undisclosed location. You can see that from the background, it's obviously got to be a spacecraft of some sort.
I think it is, yeah. That's we'll start that conspiracy.
So,
anyway.
I'm supposed to be here to talk about UFO news, right?
Yeah.
But I don't really have much.
Oh, well,
what's
okay.
kind of funny is most of the news out there is about what we've talked about the last few weeks. The Army's project with To the Stars, and then also the Navy confirming that those videos were real, something I feel they already told us really back in December 2017 with the New York Times, but that's still making some headlines. So those are the big headlines kind of out there, which is interesting that, even right now, if you Google UFO news, that's mostly what you're going to find. One cool piece, though, is that ArmyTimes.com also did an article on this. So that's pretty interesting, too. So, just to catch people up, I'm sure people have already heard, To the Stars is going to work with the Army of all people with examining some of these what are being labeled metamaterials. There's probably a better term I think that people could use. Really, they're kind of maybe UAP material might be accurate, because they're material that allegedly comes from unidentified aerial phenomena. So doesn't that seem right? UAP material seems like it would be better than metamaterial, which is so vague a term.
Well, yeah. I think, now, was this what is considered arts parts? Is that, do we know the origin of these materials?
We don't know the origins of all the materials. Who did a great, Richard Dolan did an analysis of what materials they probably are at the International UFO Congress. So you could get that DVD at ufocongress.com, and it'll be posted on the videos on demand soon. But yeah, Richard Dolan did a great talk on that. But arts parts is one of those pieces, but just one of many, or of several, supposedly. And we don't know the origins of all of them. So hopefully we'll find that out in time, and that will be really interesting. Some people are a little concerned if you're partnering up with the Army, could it be potentially that we won't be getting information? And but from what I understand, that the intentions are to get the information out to people as soon as they can. But the Army does have, if they're participating in the project, then they have a say as to when that will come out, and that's got some people concerned, no doubt. But
well, I think it's a two-way street with them, because when I read through the agreement, it basically said that both sides have to give concede to written permission to share anything, and within 30 days of sharing. So both sides have to agree on it.
Right. So, which is going to be the nature of these sort of things, even if it wasn't the Army and if it was another organization. Let's say, it was Ball Aerospace or somebody like that, or Lockheed or something. It'd probably be similar. So I think that's something to consider. And I think, what I would say is it's interesting to watch all of this, because what we're seeing is kind of the mainstreaming of the topic. Which is extraordinary to be able to see this, I feel, having been in this, and I don't know how you feel, but, we're seeing what would happen when mainstream institutions start to kind of tackle this issue, and how would they do it. And, many of us have been discussing these sort of things for a while. What would happen? How would this work? And some of those people that have already, been in this space, such as people who are scientists, or people who are in the government, people like John Alexander, let's say, and Nick Pope, who have experience with some of this sort of thing, having worked in the government and paranormal studies. So I think that's essentially what we're seeing, is how the mainstream handles it. And it's kind of interesting that so far, first, we've seen the military becoming so open about all of this and willing to participate. And, I think some might feel it's them getting in front of things, which I think is always wise of any organization. When you foresee that you're going to be challenged with questions or information, it's best to be proactive and to get involved so that you can, be seen in a positive, proactive light. And so we've seen that from the Navy and from now the Army. As far as results and how will that work, we'll have to see. Will it become another kind of Project Blue Book, which had major PR problems? At the beginning, they were pretty open, and it was a very positive sort of project. And what happened? Well, the first conclusion they came to was it could be aliens. Leadership didn't like that, and things then did a total 180, and they debunked. And for the next couple of years, they got to be seen as a waste of time. As if you have a sighting, don't go to Project Blue Book. And Ruppelt, who started Project Blue Book, even said, he talked to scientists, and that was their sentiment, that you're just going to debunk. You don't really have an interest in this topic, because they so wanted to debunk everything after that first Project Sign report. And so that was a challenge of Ruppelt, is to try to reboot then and to create a public, facing organization with credibility. But that was difficult to do. When he talked about 1952 and Washington, D.C., and, UFOs flying over, and Blue Book even able to essentially take over the control tower during one of these incidents. What happened? Well, the Army sent out, General Samford, who gave us an answer, a prosaic answer, that it was just weather inversions in radars. But that was BS. As Ruppelt says, they didn't even check with us as to what our investigation was, because we had already ruled that out. They weren't interested in, the actual facts of the investigation. They were just interested in telling the public something. Now, in that same press conference, though, General Samford said that they do receive incredible sightings from incredible resources. Yeah. Forget how he said it, but essentially very credible people. So I think that's something to look at going forward. How is the Army going to handle it now? I don't believe that To the Stars, personally, from my conversations with people in To the Stars, that they would want to be a Heineck, want to be someone to explain away cases for the Army. I think they're genuinely interested. And certainly we've heard from Tom that he's very convinced that, some of these things come from elsewhere. So we'll see what happens. I think it's going to be a tricky relationship between the Army and To the Stars, and it'll be a tricky relationship between the public and both of those entities as well, as they kind of figure out, how to maneuver around all of this. So it ought to be interesting. And then
interesting is a good word for it. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't really heard from the scientific community very much. We've heard from some of the talking heads, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Michio Kaku, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Seth Shostak, and of course you had him on the show, the most recent interview. And the latter, being more skeptical, whereas Neil deGrasse Tyson and especially Michio Kaku being much more positive about the whole idea of investigating all of this stuff. So I think that's interesting too. That just shows that at least the talking heads for science out there are on the fence still, but considering it, which is a lot more than what we've seen in the past, where they really haven't considered it anymore. And I think that they're going to have more and more pressure, just like the pressure you put on Shostak. He's got to confront this issue in a more educated manner than he has, and you pointed that out. And I think Bill Nye is going to have to do the same, because they will face challenges. And thus far, in my humble opinion, Bill Nye and Shostak have not demonstrated that they're educated on the issue, and their conclusions have been based off of the poor and small amounts of information they have.
And they seem kind of angry about it. Well, anyway.
They do. They're forced into the position. I think Shostak for years has tried to avoid it because, of course, they had a real struggle. They were in To the Stars position, 20, 30 years ago, when they were fighting for legitimacy, when people thought what SETI was doing was silly, looking for aliens. Things have changed so much for them. And now, even NASA arguably is largely a SETI organization, looking for extraterrestrial life out there. Maybe not intelligence yet, but they're looking for microbes and the such. That's a major part of their program. So things have changed quite a bit. And how did they change for SETI? SETI had to be hypersensitive about being seen as scientific. So you can see how they would be a little more skittish to attaching themselves to something that may seem more fringe. And so they're being careful about it. But they can't ignore it. And they can't be, I think, careful to the point where they are being, obviously unscientific about things. And really, in my humble opinion, I think Seth should educate himself on the matter, which he probably doesn't want to be forced into doing. Yeah. But at some point, he's going to have to give some more educated answers, I think. And that'll be fun to see them challenged and to see this all evolve.
That's right. Well, thank you. We went a little bit over time, and I got to get Steve in here. Thanks so much, Alejandro, and I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you.
All right. Bye. Have a good one. All right, everyone. My next guest, Paradigm Research Group, is Stephen Bassett. And Stephen, welcome to the show.
Morton, I heard the intro you had with Alejandro, and your viewers should know that he's in witness protection.
Okay, good to know.
That's where he is. He's in witness protection program. Has been for some time.
Okay. Hey, can you turn your camera on, Steve?
You want me to turn the camera on?
Yeah, if you can. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Let's give it a shot here and see what happened.
Steve, so why don't you...
camera is on.
Getting a little bit of feedback. There you go. Welcome to the show. And, I say that on the show almost every week now, because I actually can see through analytics and things like that. I have new people listening to the show all the time. Someone may not know who you are. Quickly, in a nutshell, can you go over that and tell us what you're up to, something new? So let's, first of all, just introduce yourself to the new listener, if you would.
Yeah, I'm the executive director of Paradigm Research Group, which was formed in '96 to pursue the political resolution, not the scientific resolution, but the political resolution of the extraterrestrial issue. I did this because I'd come to conclude that the problem was not science. Even by '96, there was more than enough science to prove the extraterrestrial presence. So what was the problem? Well, the problem was there was a political decision part of the government going all the way back to the late 40s, early 1950s, that this issue would be suppressed, embargoed, as I like to call it, denied, undermined, misinformation, disinformation, for national security reasons. It's a legal national security policy. So essentially, the most profound information probably in the history of the human race was embargoed by our government and its allies. And it had a lot of allies back in early 1950s. Some of the more authoritarian countries, like Soviet Union, Communist China, went the same way, perhaps for different reasons. So what do? Pile science on top of science on top of science and have the government go, we don't know what you're talking about? That's not how I roll. So I got involved in the politics of this and have been a political activist, registered lobbyist. And I'm going to continue to do that until we get the announcement, we get the formal confirmation from the government.
Now, when you had your big, huge event there that kind of pushed things forward, are you still getting ripples from that? I mean, are things still happening from that? And that was, 4 years ago now? 3 years ago?
Actually, there's been a lot that's happened. 2013 was a citizen hearing on disclosure. And then as the plan follow up to that, I came back to Washington 2014, just November. We delivered a full 30-hour set of DVDs to every member of Congress, just to let them know that had happened. And I began to develop a story for the political campaign of 2015-16, which happened to involve a woman by the name of Senator Hillary Clinton, who was the leading candidate and the likely person to be president, and worked that story into the mainstream media until it caught fire, and generating 400 plus articles about the connection between her and John Podesta and her husband to the ET issue, going all the way back to the early 1990s, or early 1990s. But the nature of media right now is still that they'll only go so far. So while 400 articles were written, the debate moderators refused to touch the issue, and she was able to avoid having to confront it more than she had. And we had forced them to speak to the issue a number of times, about 11 or 12 total. And she was going to just get to the White House. I believe she intended to disclose, not shortly into her first term. And a lot of other people did as well. But that didn't happen. So things changed. I went to Europe for most of 2017, came back early 2018. Went and was based in California. But then in June of this year, I became aware that the To the Stars Academy, which I've been following very closely and supporting from the day it was launched, had been meeting on the Hill with members of Congress, that a pilot briefing of the president had taken place. And I knew at that point I had to get back to Washington, D.C. It wasn't going to be easy either. So I set about trying to raise some money and make the necessary arrangements that would allow me to get back here. And not just get back to stay, which I intend to do until disclosure come, but also to get an office. And the office I wanted was in the National Press Building. It's not easy to get in there, and I spent some time just working it, and an opportunity came about, and I was able to secure an office. That office is now open. It's done. It's completed. But it's an office studio, because the plan is to launch soon a video podcast. You've heard of podcast, I think, Martin? Podcast, the National Press Building out of Washington, D.C. And that is about 2 blocks from the White House. So it would be the first streaming broadcast of any kind, formally coming out of Washington, D.C. on all matters exopolitical. So that is the plan. And it's bold. It's not as bold as what the TTSA is doing. I mean, they're way out in front. They got a battle cruiser out there, but it has possibilities. My my primary goal is to use the special location of the podcast, to use the fact that I'm a member of the press club, which is housed in the penthouse of that building, to meet, greet, and convince some mainstream people to interview, to speak about this issue and interview in a highly intelligent, safe space that would have never done that before. It's not doing live stuff on this issue for somebody that's got a high level position in either politics or journalism or academia. Not even a concern. So, but this will be a taped podcast, and the beauty of that is that if the person is not comfortable with how the interview goes and it can't be fixed, then it just doesn't get aired. I won't put it up. So I'm not looking to grill people. I'm not looking to investigative journalists. I'm looking to be a conduit or a bridge between the developing mainstream world interest in this issue and the general public, because I am a political activist and a populist, and that's another reason why I got back to DC, is that once I knew that the To the Stars Academy was in fact lobbying Congress, which is what they're doing. You don't have to be registered to do that, as long as you're not. Well, let me put it this way. It's complicated, but the point is they were obviously on the Hill talking to members about their issues and what have you, and that's fine. But it was clear to me that those issues were those of the military intelligence complex from which they came, which is appropriate. The military intelligence complex has an array of concerns and issues and interests with respect to the disclosure process, pre-disclosure, the disclosure event itself, and the post-disclosure world. So that they would be wanting to talk to members of Congress about it makes total sense. Of course, I know where that's going. Eventually, it's going to hearings when the political hurricane ends here in D.C. But that's not me. I represent only the American people. I try to represent their interests, not just complex interests, because that obviously is well represented right now. And I, until recently, was still the only registered lobbyist on the issue, which I did in order to appeal to the media, because they check these things. But the co-host for this coming podcast, which is called The Disclosure Wire, will be Teresa Tyndall, who is the currently state director of MUFON, Maryland, among other things. Mm-hmm. And she's going to provide a very powerful networking component. She's also registered as a lobbyist, so now there's 2 registered federal lobbyists. Finally, only took 23 years to get the second one. And it was the pay. The pay is just so good, people are afraid of it. Right? Afraid they're going to make a lot of money. It's going to ruin their life. Yeah. Whatever. So that gives you a sense of what's happened on my world, starting with the citizen hearing on disclosure, going through the 2016 election, a hiatus in Europe, where I did go to Moscow and do an interview that had never been done before. But nevertheless, finally, I've got to get back to D.C. And as crazy as it is in this town right now, I got to be.
Oh, well, Steve, let us know. We are actually out of time. We have to go into break. And so that'll be it for us. But can you tell us where we can actually get to this? And is it on your website?
Well, if you go to Paradigm, it isn't up yet. You go to Paradigm Research Group, the main website. There's a link right there to the Indiegogo funding campaign. We wanted to we set a goal of 10,000. We reached that about 2 days ago. We're going to keep it up and develop some additional funding. And the information about the podcast is extensively right there in that Indiegogo campaign, linked from paradigmresearchgroup.org.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and I wish you great luck with that. I will be checking it out for sure. All right, you take care.
Bye.
Bye now. All right, everyone, hang in there. We have to go to a break, and we'll be right back right after these messages. All right, we are back. We have our guests, Jennifer Stein and Peter Robbins. Both have been on the show. Peter, a number of times. Jennifer, 3 or 4 times, I think, altogether. But welcome to the show, you two.
Thank you, Martin.
Yes, and I really enjoy hanging out with both of you. I saw Jennifer out in Phoenix, and Peter, you and I have run into each other a number of times over the years. It's
Indeed.
Always a lot of fun. And I consider you both really good people, and I'm really glad that you both work together And if you're on YouTube now and you look in the background, Jennifer, what are those awards behind you?
Well, I it's my office, and those are some Ebby awards. These
Oh,
guys are kind of fun. I think
yep.
I can reach one. Oh, can I? Yeah, just a second.
Oh, this ought to
These
be interesting.
these are
Yeah.
these funky looking guys. They're the little
Oh, yes.
UFO
Yep.
characters that Open Minds gives out,
Oh, yes. Yep.
and they are a gray alien, and it's holding a video camera, and it's got a little reel under its arm, so it's very cute. So I've been the lucky winner of 4 of their awards, and the others are some film festivals in Orlando, and just some other awards in the UFO community. It's nice to have it. What do you do with them? You stick them in your office. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you deserve those awards, and you do a really nice job. One of the things we are going to be talking about Forrestal, but just also other topics as well. For those people that were writing me saying that they don't want to hear about Forrestal, we'll talk about other things as well. But how did you, Jennifer? How did you get interested in this topic? I believe I heard you talk one time. I think
you did. I think up in Maine at
Yeah,
the
that was a long time
Experience
ago.
Speak conference. I think that's
Yeah,
when I first met you, Martin.
that's right. Yeah.
Well, I had a sighting, a personal sighting. I've had more than one now in my life, but the first one was when I was 19, and it was a significant sighting, like 80, 90 feet long, 5, 6 feet high, a rectangle of white light, which made no sense to me at that point in my life. I wasn't really following the UFO topic. It was 1975, and I was 19 years old, and it occurred right outside my bedroom window where I lived near Lansdale, Pennsylvania. And it kind of stayed in my gray box. I was journaling, and I had written it down, but I didn't know how to understand it. And it stayed in my gray box for about almost 25 years until I had the luck of encountering someone who was at my house at that time and had the same experience I had. And once we kind of compared notes, which we did independently, I told him, go write your stuff down. I don't want you messing with my memory. I have my memory, but I don't know what you saw. And once I looked at his drawings and diagrams and his story he wrote out, I realized, okay, that was real. And that was when I was about 45. So that's when I kind of just profoundly decided, okay, either I'm going to allow this to inform myself, I'm going to start to educate myself, I'm going to start to go to conferences, read books and whatnot. And shortly after that, I met Peter Robbins at the Rochester MUFON conference. And that's kind of how I...
But, whoops, I don't know if we lost you. Peter, you there?
I am.
Fun. And
Oh, there she's
did you
back.
just lose me? Did you lose me?
Yeah,
No, okay.
you froze.
I jumped for a second. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So Ruben Uriarte, who was the state director of MUFON, encouraged me to start an active MUFON group in Pennsylvania because there wasn't one. So I did in 2000, and I've had the pleasure of bringing in speakers. And Martin, by interviewing people and going to conferences and reading books, you learn a tremendous amount. And my life has never been the same. I never looked back. I've been grateful for the wonderful people like Peter that I've just come to admire, and they are mentors to me. Stanton Friedman was a huge mentor to me, and I just continue to learn and challenge myself. And it's very humbling because this is not an easy field and not an easy topic to wrap your brain around.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, and I also agree with what you just said, that it's this whole topic has kind of enriched my life. I mean, it's interesting, and you meet some wonderful people. I mean, I'm really enjoying myself, hanging out with some people that we share at least a curiosity about what's going on. Maybe we'll never find out exactly what it is, but it's still fun. Your turn, Peter. We want to find out. I know you actually had an amazing. You've told this story a number of times on this site, but again, we do have a lot of new people. You had that amazing sighting that you shared with your sister with those silver discs in New York, right?
Indeed. My sister Helen and I had a very clear daylight sighting as kids in the village that we grew up in, about 30 miles east of Manhattan, it was undeniable. It was overwhelming to me. It was something I was emotionally and informationally completely unprepared to deal with at that point in my life. What we observed coming in at a high rate of speed and stopping over the neighbor's house were 6 silvery white disc-shaped objects, essentially ellipses, like holding a dinner plate at an angle, in a very precise military V, as in Victor type formation. And they just hung there for an interminably long period of time, close enough that we could see they were obviously metallic, not shiny like stainless steel, more like, non-reflective aluminum or something, and that we could make out regular detailing around the edge of each, which in comparing notes many years later, we both could only draw on how windows looked on a commercial aircraft at an appreciable distance. But I was overwhelmed by it, and I refused to speak with my sister about it, who never forgot it, and made myself forget it. It became my repressed memory of childhood, although I occasionally joke with people that if I have other repressed memories from childhood, I don't remember them. But it took more than 14 years for that memory to reemerge, and when it did like a freight train. And
didn't it come through artwork? Your work, weren't you?
Partially. It was several contributing factors. I think the most important one being that my mind was ready to deal with this subject, but the triggers were going through a number of drawings that I had recently been given by my grandmother that she had saved from my childhood, at a time when most relatives, adults, did not save kids' drawings. My theory is because it was before they invented refrigerator magnets. Be that as it may, none of the drawings related to the subject, but several of the drawings were done at about that time in my life. That combined with the fact that I had lost quite a bit of sleep. It had just been the Chinese New Year, and I lived in Chinatown, and back in those days, the police looked the other way with fireworks, and you were essentially in a zone that for 72 hours or so smelled like cordite, and the noise never stopped. And I had taken a human potential workshop fairly recently before that, which essentially gave me more things to think about. But it all came together in the course of about 15 minutes or so. And it absolutely immobilized me. I was shocked in that I knew how real it was. I thought I must be going crazy, because how could anybody forget something so profoundly impacting? Certainly the most significant moment of my childhood. I now understand that the human mind can certainly do an extraordinary job repressing things, but I waited until I had kind of calmed down, had a cup of tea, thought things out before calling my sister, who lived a mile or so north of me in the East Village, mostly as a poet at the time, and had enough forethought to not tell her what I remembered, because I knew if I did, she'd either say yes or no, and I wouldn't know for sure. In my heart, very much the same spirit as Jennifer, having that experiencer write down and do his drawings before they compared notes. And I chose to set the scene and described the time of year, about how old we were, where we were standing in front of the house, what the weather was like. And she cut me off mid-sentence, Martin, and then proceeded to tell me what I had remembered, with one slight variation, the number of craft, which we worked out very quickly the next day. But more to the point, that she said there was more. And then went on to describe what now, sometimes even word for word, is an archetypical series of fragmented memories that many, many people who have had the UFO abductions experience share. This was not only new to me, but it was not part of the culture, except for Interrupted Journey, the very fine book about Betty and Barney Hill's experience, which happened 10 years before that. Actually, it happened the year that we had our sighting. I was clueless and at the same time completely shocked by my sister's memories of flying through the air, of walking through a curved metal hallway, of being on the table. The term gray was not in the culture for some years after that, so she described the beings as best as she could from her 12-year-old memory. And, people use the phrase, my life changed overnight. Mine changed in about 10 minutes and ultimately served to derail the career that I had longed for, aimed for, was beginning to make a reality, namely being a serious painter in New York City, because something more important had come up, and I resented it tremendously. I continued to teach painting, to paint, but the heart had gone out of it. And after a number of years, I just began to devote myself full-time to UFO studies.
Thank you for all that. That's really fascinating. And I have to tell you, you've told me this story on my show, which was about, I don't know how many shows in. It was just a few shows in when we met. We met fairly early on when I started my show. And,
that's right.
And the reason I'm bringing that up, your story is exactly the same. Nothing has changed at all, and which is always a very good sign.
I'll work on it, add some details next time.
That's good. Yeah, now you'll be normal. So Forrestal, let's talk about him. Whose brainchild was this to do this film about him? And I understand a lot of I didn't get a chance to. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to see it, but I understand a lot of it is footage of him that was dug up. But anyway, why don't you get into that a little bit, how that all came about?
Well, I wouldn't say a lot of it, but some of it.
Okay.
The life and death of James Vincent Forrestal, our first Secretary of Defense, has fascinated me and at times obsessed me on and off for more than 30 years. I learned about him first in 1987, a fairly significant year for me in the work, and a year that I had decided to really commit myself to this work professionally. At the 1987 International MUFON Symposium, held that year at American University in Washington, D.C., Stan Friedman gave a presentation that in a way changed my life. I had first heard Stan speak 10 years before when I was very new in this, but had the privilege of working on being an editor on a paper that had been requested by the Secretary General of the UN on a possible triggering of nuclear war by a misidentification of a truly anomalous UFO. And for that work, I earned the right to be in the General Assembly Hall during a series of meetings of the Special Political Committee, which Stan addressed, along with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, Jacques Vallée, a Captain Coyne, Army captain who had been involved in a very well-documented helicopter semi-abduction. And it was on the secret life of a man who most of us knew in the work as a debunker, but a quiet academic one, the head of astronomy studies at Harvard, who went on to become the mentor of Philip Klass, probably the best-known UFO debunker. And it was called The Secret Life of Donald K. Menzel. And in it, by dint of sheer scholarship and research and high intention, and extraordinarily well documented, Stan had gotten permission to go into the Harvard archives and access all of the papers around Menzel, then in the National Archives, and then became the only person to add a third, which was permission from Menzel's widow to go over his personal papers. And what Stan established was Menzel did indeed live a double life. He was the head academic on astronomy at Harvard, and as such had great sway in the astronomy community. But he was also a trusted member of our national security apparatus, which even his wife was not aware of. Anyway, it was about the same time that the MJ-12 briefing paper, the 8-page memorandum to President-elect Eisenhower, with the attached 1-page letter from September of 47 from Truman to Forrestal as the new and first Secretary of Defense to begin his work on this particular topic. And I decided I was going to write a paper and do the research, modeling it on stands. And I had it down to 2 or 3 of the members of MJ-12. The other one who was closest was Dr. Vannevar Bush, Roosevelt and Truman's science and technology advisor, one of the most extraordinary Americans ever. I won't even go into, I could spend the whole show talking about Bush, no relation to the current crop. Anyway, I spoke with my parents shortly after, had dinner with them, and sitting with my mom, talking about the project, showing her this memorandum, telling her who I had it down to, and she said, do Forrestal. I said, well, that's pretty definitive. Why? She said, number one, you have no idea how important he was to us during World War II. His name was in the news as often as Harry Truman's was. He genuinely, as an individual, was credited with helping us win the war as Assistant Secretary of Navy, had lived an absolute storybook life, almost Horatio Alger-like. The arc on the narrative of his life, I compare in the documentary to had Scott Fitzgerald needed or wanted a real character to base his most famous literary character on, Jay Gadsby, James Forrestal could have been that person. Anyway, she went on to say that when he committed suicide, which was the understanding at the time, the nation went into deep mourning. And she said, for me, it might have been the closest thing I had to your experience as a young person to President Kennedy's murder. And then she said, and, you know, he was incredibly handsome. He was a very sharp dresser. He hung out with movie stars and writers, and I had a crush on him. And I thought, well, that's that. My mother had a crush on the first Secretary of Defense, who I think may have been murdered, and I got to work. But intermittently. I first spoke about the subject not until 2004, then continued to write about him, to do presentations, which brings us up to about 2 years ago, when I expressed to Jennifer and a number of other close colleagues that I was searching for some medium, some way to reach a larger audience than the one that people like me traditionally reach. Let's face it, if Jennifer and I speak at a conference, the great majority of people that are there, we're preaching to the choir. They're already interested, they're already involved, they either believe or are studying the subject. And how do you break through that in the world of conferences and podcasts and, you know, the set universe of ufology? And I thought, I have a background in theater, and a fairly extensive one. I worked for years off Broadway in management and had the great thrill of working with Tony Award winners and Academy Award winners, also assistant directing. And I thought perhaps there's a way, without writing a play, because I'm not a playwright, that I can bring this into a more a staged reading where I create a script. I have images illustrating what I'm saying, but I'm not standing there with a clicker moving the slides forward. I can concentrate on the script and tell this story in a very strictly chronological timeline, but not even mention the subject of UFOs until it came up chronologically. The story begins in the 1890s when Forrestal is born, and the first mention of the subject is 1947. My hope being that by then, serious listeners who might never go to a UFO conference, but would certainly go to a play and might be interested in seeing a slightly dramatized, just in terms of the words that I used and how I handled them, the images behind me, treatment of a really interesting story about an American, a true hero, a patriot, a very decent man who had been written out of American history and who may in fact have been murdered. And then how do I present the case? Because I knew I would be speaking to attorneys as well as laymen. Ultimately, I workshopped it several times, first in a friend's apartment with about 20 people in New York City about 2 years ago, then before a terrific, like Jennifer's mainline MUFON, a group called the Rochester UFO Meetup Group, run by the indomitable Cookie Stringfellow, and that was a bit smoother. Ultimately, brings us to last April, when I was scheduled to speak for Jennifer's group. And that early afternoon, we had some hours before the talk, and Jennifer said, I have a home studio, and with Bob Terrio, our third wheel, who oversaw the placement and the use of all the visual material, was Jennifer's cameraman on the outstanding award-winning Travis, the true story of Travis Walton documentary. That with the green screen, Jen said, I have a new piece of equipment, which is a teleprompter. Have you ever used one? And I said, no, never. And she said, well, I've loaded your script into it. Let's give it a go. And I had thought if we were going to do it, I'd work as usual with a sheath of papers that I'd half memorized coming and going from them. It's a very different experience staring into this box for an interminable amount of time and doing my best to keep in contact, remembering that if it worked well, the illusion would be that I was speaking directly to viewers the same way, we're used to newsreaders, that illusion that they're speaking to us when, we're just part of a large audience and they're speaking into a mechanical device. Anyway, when it was done, I turned it over technically to Bob and Jennifer. I had assembled most of the images, but I hadn't even thought about adding film images. I'm, an independent researcher. I fund all my own stuff, and having Jennifer as an overseeing producer, I knew would allow me some latitude. She and Bob found some wonderful film footage, which we use, I think, very well. And the ending impact, it's only been shown publicly twice. Once as a finalist in the International UFO Congress Film Festival. We got a very nice mention and up against stiff competition. And about a little over a week ago, for the MUFON group in Syracuse, New York, where I speak sometimes as well. And we've now had more and more people taking a look at it who not only find it engaging, but very moving. And within the next few weeks, it will be available internationally online or to be ordered as a DVD. And that will be the true test. But it's an important story. And before I relinquish the floor, just to say, why even bother with a story that's 60 years old, 70 years old? It's old history. Well, it's a very important window into the early days of the UFO cover-up and a very different perception about the nature of secrecy, who could keep it, who could not. A very tragic twist, literally a Greek tragedy that his life story ends with. And I document everything. If anybody is interested, after seeing it, there's a long bibliography attached of 35 or so print sources, and we're looking forward to get going.
Excellent. Okay.
Do you have one, Peter? You can hold up. Do you have a DVD?
Actually, we'll bring that back when we come back. We have to go into a break right now. So hang in, everyone. We'll be right back right after these messages. We'll be back with Jennifer Stein and Peter Rock. My guests this evening are Jennifer Stein and Peter Robbins. We're going to be talking about the James Forrestal case for a while, and then, of course, we'll get into other things. Peter, I'll ask you this, Jennifer. What was your involvement in this any curiosity about Forrestal himself, or was it just to work with Peter?
Well, both. Peter is I have such admiration for Peter. I mean, what author takes books that they have off the market, who's made a life, career, and interest in researching and studying this work, and then takes the products they have and no longer has them? And I looked at his research and was so impressed with it. I said, Peter, let's do an experiment. I mean, I literally just threw this at him. I don't think he expected it at all. I said, if you can read this from paper, you can read it from a teleprompter. Let's just put you in front of a green screen and see what happens. And he was like, well, like, do we have time before we go to the meeting? I said, sure, we have an hour and a half. Let's just try it. So I made lunch. I invited Bob over. I invited another filmmaker over. And I think Peter didn't know quite what hit him. But I wanted to get him in front of a camera. And I thought, gosh, he's got this great PowerPoint done. I did a project like this a number of years ago with Kathy Martin. She wanted to release the audio tapes of Betty and Barney. And I said, wait, don't release that in audio because everyone will bootleg it. Let's do a video. And I literally sat her down in front of a camera, interviewed her, and then took her PowerPoint and made a quick, simple video for her called In Their Own Words. And she loves it. She's grateful that she has it. And Bob and I did that. And I thought we could do something similar with the Forrestal project. And Peter would have another product to go out to the UFO community with, you know. It helps to have books and products that people can identify you with. And I thought that the research he did on Forrestal was tremendously important because we are starting to see disclosure in a way now that we never had before. And what's happening is everyone is hearkening now back to, well, when did all this disclosure begin? Well, boom, it's right there with Forrestal. You know, 1947 to 1949 to 1952, all these important parts of history become extremely important. If you're going to be an historian and really understand this topic, you need to understand the veil of secrecy. And you need to understand who James Forrestal was. And for me, it was an eye-opening experience. I learned a lot, and I've even learned more. I mean, if you think about what was going on in that period of time. You know, in fact, Linda Howe and I were just on a cruise together, this UFO cruise that went out of San Diego, and we were sitting around with about 25 people, and we were thinking, okay, what was happening between January and like July of 1947. This was right when the height of this, the codification of secrecy was starting, and MJ-12 was forming, and Forrestal was moving into his position. And you think about it, there were like 4 or 5 major events. Like in January, Admiral Byrd, right, took off and went to Antarctica. Of course, I don't remember this in my life history because I wasn't even born yet. I wasn't born until 1955, but apparently there was a lot of hoopla. He left with like an armada to go to, Antarctica. Why? We weren't at war anymore. And then everything gets hushed up in the news, and he makes this announcement from Chile that he's had a very strange experience there, and then he comes back and never talks about it. That was very strange, and I think he lost half his fleet. He went with 14 ships and a Navy, a Navy carrier and things. So that was incredible, right? If he really had an encounter down there with UFOs, which everyone thinks. Then you go to May 1947. You've got the famous Socorro case, right?
And
Lonnie
wait a
Zamora.
minute, in what year?
1947.
No, that wasn't Socorro.
That wasn't Socorro? I thought that was all the same year. Then you have June 14, 1947. You've got Kenneth Arnold, right, in the Cascade Mountains. Of course, he comes out. He's an experienced pilot. He knows what he's seeing, and I think he designed aircraft. I think he was an aircraft engineer. And then you have July 1947, the whole Roswell case. So bam, 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 bam. You have all these things happening. And you think, gosh, what was going on for James? What was he being thrown into? And what was he having to digest? We don't really go into all these events all these UFO events in the film. It mostly just follows James' life, so you can climb inside his life and understand who he was. And I really commend Peter. This is one of the things that I tried to do with the Travis film, and Peter just mentioned it, but I think it's very, very important. There are many intelligent people that won't even begin to digest the topic of UFOs because it's been this, forbidden topic. It's a not polite dinner conversation, right? You don't go to a cocktail party and start talking about it. You'll be alienated. So to do something historically accurate that suggests there might be a difficult history and past to someone who should be remembered as a real hero in our country and is not, and was probably murdered over this topic, I think it forces anyone in the general public interested in this topic and interested in the history to go do their own digging. And this type of documentary can get out to the mainstream. Just like the Travis film I did. I didn't do a film about UFOs. I did a film that was about this man's personal life and how it was destroyed. And all the 7 loggers' lives in many ways were destroyed over having this incident happen to them. And the film became a bit of a breakthrough film. I mean, we made it into mainstream festivals that would never accept a documentary on UFOs, but because they didn't know who Travis was and they watched it, a lot of the festival, screeners said, hey, I love this film. I love this film. I love this film. I want it in our festival. So we made it in, I think I applied to 50 film festivals. I got into 28 and I think I won like 8 awards on top of getting into the festivals. So I think that the Forrestal project had that potential. And that's why I sat Peter down and said, look, let's do something with this. And actually, we dedicated it to Stanton Friedman.
Oh, isn't that great?
We had just lost Stanton. Or actually, when we started this in April, Stanton was still alive.
That's
and I
right.
think we had decided to dedicate it to him already.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he died, it was even more important to get it out there.
You bet.
Wow. A couple of things. First of all, that was 1964 for the Socorro incident.
Oh, thank you.
That's
okay.
no big deal. But I do want to, and I don't care either one of you want to tackle this, but I've heard MJ12 come up a number of times, and that's a controversial topic. And,
it is, Martin.
Whether MJ12 actually existed or not. And does either one of you want to tackle that? What your thoughts are?
Let me go first.
Okay.
Another thing that Stanton Friedman was able to establish through a very careful, extended search of records within the National Archives was locating 2 completely authentic, independent documents that were independent of anything associated with UFOs, identifying a MJ12 or Magic 12, as it's sometimes known, working group, a highly secured working group within the government with no reference to what the group was about. Like many people in the field who have studied this material to one degree or another, I have a lot of problems with a lot of it. Again, going back to the summer of 1987, a 8-page document purporting to be a briefing document on Roswell and associated subjects for then President-elect Eisenhower identified this original working group of 12 individuals around Truman. However, in the intervening decade since 87, I'm sure no less than several hundred documents purporting to be Majestic 12 or MJ12 documents have come out. I agree with Stan's conclusions that the initial 8-page briefing document and the 1-page attached letter from Truman to Forrestal are authentic. And I go to some pains in the documentary to make sure that one can see how they fit letter perfect aspects of them with the known timeline, and then make sure that in each case, if they were proved to be not authentic, the letter and the briefing document, that within that exact same time frame, we have other material to draw on that supports the same conclusions. So I do go on at the end, because I know I'm talking hopefully primarily to folks who are not involved in the subject, a very brief summation on MJ12. In no way is this documentary about it. It simply refers to it. And even in the brief treatment of an hour, based in more than 30 years of investigation, 5 members of the 12 come up playing roles directly involved with Forrestal's life and interfacing with him personally throughout the narrative.
I'll say in the Travis film, we actually have Stanton speaking about a significant archive he also came across, where it was Donald Menzel writing President Kennedy. And Menzel says, once Kennedy comes into office...
President-elect Kennedy.
I'm sorry, it was President-elect Kennedy at that point when Menzel was writing the letter. Menzel says, when we are properly cleared, I can tell you more. And it was about, I believe, it was making reference to unidentified craft or things, high-level, secret space-related topic. I don't remember the exact title of the document, but Stanton does refer to this.
Yes, he's talked about it on my show a few times.
Yeah, and it stunned Stanton. So that is, there are these pieces that become like these smoking guns.
Correct.
And that's all we have, Martin. And, you can, when we speculate, we have to be very clear that we are speculating. But when we're just bringing you facts, then you can go do your own digging and research based on those facts. And that's what I really like about the Forrestal Project, because Peter lays out the facts for you. And he actually has, and he's willing to send it to anybody, like a 22-page bibliography list. He wanted to put it in the credits of the film. And Bob and I said, people just aren't going to sit there for 15 minutes and watch, these credits roll.
It's not that long. It's 35 separate items, but I hear you.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm exaggerating, but still, people can go look at this bibliography and start to do their own research. He doesn't speculate in this. It's all based on this happened, this happened, this happened. And isn't it an interesting mystery that there's synchronicity between these events? He kind of asks you if there is. And he asks you at the end of the film, don't you think we should really be remembering Forrestal in a better light? He's all but completely forgotten.
Yeah.
And also, well, the subline on this movie is his extraordinary life and mysterious death or something like that.
Suspicious death, yes.
Suspicious death. So what about his death? I know he fell from I forgot what floor it was, whether he jumped. But if I remember right, I recall, wasn't someone visiting him right before that happened?
Yes. Well, Peter can speak to it better, and more accurately with the facts than I can. But yes, I think it's
go ahead,
Peter.
Yeah. The case that I present, although I think it's very compelling, obviously I don't have a smoking gun. It is all circumstantial evidence, but extraordinarily interlocking. People have gone to prison with less evidence presented in court proceedings. To sum it up, because it's quite a series of interconnected events, part of my basic premise is Forrestal, who had, I'll call it a character flaw of never seeming to fully be able to confide completely with another person. It was evident in his many romantic affairs, very Kennedy-esque, but fairly brusque. He was bottled up emotionally. And less than 9 weeks or so following whatever it was that crashed in the plains of San Augustine, some miles from a little town called Roswell, New Mexico, he became the first Secretary of Defense, a position he created. He is the architect of our modern Department of Defense. It was not put together by a committee, but at Harry Truman's request by this one man. and he became the leader of it. If one looks at the description, the job description for Secretary of Defense, all the weight of the world rests on your shoulders, at least allegorically. You know everything that the president knows about classified information. And on the day that he was sworn in, very, very suddenly, for reasons coinciding with the first published secret report on these truly anomalous craft, it was his responsibility to get to the bottom of things, to find out what was going on, to effect some kind of interaction or be able to report to the president and his advisors what they were up against. For many of us, if we have a bad day at the office or the equivalent, you go home, watch some TV, pet the dog, have dinner, and do a better job the next day. Forrestal carried it all with him. He had a habit of personalizing his personal failures and his professional failures, as well as his successes. And we watch on the timeline as UFO activity becomes more virulent, and he is unable to give any satisfactory answer to the president, even heading the largest and most powerful defense establishment in the history of the post-Atlantean world, in what we'll laughingly call modern times. On the very day that he steps down as Secretary of Defense, and the second Secretary of Defense, a man named Louis K. Johnson, is sworn in, on that afternoon, he has a profound and very public nervous breakdown. I'm not a mental health professional, but I've networked with a tremendous number of them over the decades.
When you say public, what do you mean by public?
That the manifestations of the breakdown were apparent to everybody assembled at his change of command ceremony. The president had just pinned whatever the Presidential Medal of Freedom or whatever the highest civilian decoration an American citizen can get on his lapel. And very movingly, and for me incredibly so, Jennifer was able to find film footage from that afternoon in the Oval Office. I had only had some stills up until then, stills and news photos. And here we have the situation where either leading up to or, doing it on camera and then doing it for the public, he pins this medal on his lapel. People in the audience who were, very moved by this, many of whom went on to become movers and shakers in government themselves, observed that after Truman said, "You deserve it, Jim," Forrestal stepped to the microphone and said, quote unquote, "It's beyond my," and just tailed off and never finished the sentence. I refer to Clark Clifford at that moment, an intern at the Pentagon who went on to become an attorney general, from his memoirs. And boy, I read everybody's memoirs over the decades who knew or interfaced with Forrestal. It was apparent to everyone in the room that something was terribly wrong. Shortly thereafter, Forrestal was seen speaking with the then Secretary for the Air Force, Stuart Symington, who went on to become a senator, and who was something of a pain in the ass to Forrestal in pushing for more money for the Air Force and things. Whatever Symington said to him was so disquieting that people were concerned. Forrestal then left the room, and they couldn't find him for some time after. When they did, he was in his old office, sitting at his desk, staring at the wall, repeating the phrase, seemingly oblivious when the door opened. When they found him, "You are a loyal fellow. You are a loyal fellow. You are a loyal fellow." He was ultimately outside the Pentagon, where he was observed to be completely disoriented by the chauffeur to Vannevar Bush, who took him back to Forrestal's townhouse in Georgetown. He called his closest friend and advisor, a banker named Ferdinand Eberstadt, who had cut the introduction in the 1930s between Forrestal and Roosevelt when Forrestal went into government service. and then came over after Forrestal had called him very upset, very disturbed by his appearance, and Forrestal told him a number of times that he felt his whole life had been a failure and he was considering killing himself. Shocking words to hear from a friend, especially on a day where you'd just been honored by the President of the United States. At that point, he asked him what it was, and he said, "I can't tell you." It exacerbates from there. Two friends, one Robert Lovett, who went on to become a Secretary of Defense himself, and the other, Eberstadt, got him on a private plane, and down to Hobie Sound, Florida, where Eberstadt had an estate. And Eberstadt was completely undone by Forrestal's appearance. He called his stay at his home the worst 3 days of his life. I'm sorry to say I document Forrestal attempting to take his life several times. From there, he is institutionalized at Bethesda Naval Hospital, kept under a 3-shift, 24-hour-a-day Marine Guard, kept heavily sedated the first few weeks, but then turned over to the good quality naval mental health staff there, who began to work with him in a prescribed manner for somebody with this level of depression, 1949. And having read the hospital records, having read accounts by everybody that went to visit him, there was no question in anyone's mind that he was coming back. He was recovering. He had gained weight that he had lost. He had put forward a will to live again. He's taking pride in his appearance. And a release date was set of May 22nd. His brother had arranged to pick him up that morning at the hospital, where Forrestal would then go to a friend's estate to complete his recovery in quiet, controlled atmosphere. And if we're to believe the official account, a few hours before he was set to be released, his attendant, who was brand new, allegedly one of the Marines on that shift who had become extremely close to Mr. Forrestal, so much so that Forrestal had talked about hiring him when he left, developing something of a father-son relationship. He didn't appear for work that evening. The rumor was he was drunk. Nothing could have been further from the truth. An attendant was assigned to Mr. Forrestal, looked at him at 1:30 in the morning, seemed to be sleeping. At 1:45, was copying a poem out of an anthology, a Sophocles poem, and declined a sleeping pill, checked on him 5 minutes later, and he was gone. Allegedly, the attendant forgot to lock the door. Forrestal goes from looking forward to release and being absolutely ready for it, as documented by hospital records and everybody that saw him, even his physicians, to a sudden state of suicidal depression, goes into the room across the hall, which is an efficiency kitchen with an unsecured window, then for some reason takes the sash off his bathrobe, ties one end tightly around his neck, lowers himself out the window. If we're to believe this, changes his mind, as indicated by numerous fingernail scratches on the outside of the window, loses his grip, and dies of suicide, and the nation goes into mourning. The investigation that the Navy did was, it would be funny if it hadn't been so insulting. Essentially, what we the public saw was the Navy covering its own behind in every possible way. And it wasn't for quite a number of years, not until the early 2000s, that the actual Willicott's report, Admiral Willicott's being the head of the institution at the time, was released. Quite fascinating. And that is where I go into a great deal of detail about the evidences, the proofs, the circumstances that I feel make a case for murder. Why was he killed? This is purely theoretical, but for me it holds water. I think it's fair to say that the three of us, and everybody in your audience included, not a single one of us don't know somebody who has been in therapy, seen a psychologist, seen a psychiatrist, met with a counselor, or had somebody in their family do so, or knew somebody who did. In 1949, it was the exact opposite. Unless you were maybe a member of society and had gone to Vienna to be analyzed by a protege of Freud's, no one knew anyone who had been in therapy. And as far as nervous breakdowns go, from the perception of the extreme alpha male club around Truman, only girls had nervous breakdowns, certainly not a tough guy, and certainly not the ultimate alpha male in their circle, who, aside from being a scholar, had read the classics, was a competitive level golfer and tennis player, a passionate amateur boxer, had exhibited tremendous courage during his run as Secretary of Navy. Unlike previous secretaries of Navy, was put himself in harm's way repeatedly, was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, at the Battle of Iwo Jima, and a number of others. But he completely broke. And I believe fervently that for these men who advised Truman, the idea that this man who knew everything, where all the allegorical bodies were buried, everything about the cover-up of the UFO mystery, if he recovered, whatever the heck that meant, couldn't he possibly have a relapse? And if he had a relapse, mightn't he say anything about anything to anyone, even in confidence? And that could not be allowed. And it took me years, Martin, to get to the point where my views had evolved enough through extended deep reading of many memoirs by people who knew Forrestal, of all of his published papers. The wonderful Forrestal diaries give us an idea of what a keen observer he was of his times and the people around him, that James Forrestal understood this as clearly as he ever understood anything in his life. And the Greek tragedy part of the story for me is once he could no longer hold it together. I'm not insinuating in any way that the nervous breakdown just happened out of nowhere in late March of 1947 on the day that he stepped down from that very high office. It obviously had been building up, but not being manifested in a public way. Once the reins of power had been turned over, he literally collapsed that afternoon. He knew that they felt he couldn't be trusted anymore. And I think it's a tragic moment in American history and a mark of his character that he got it. It was nothing personal, as I sometimes say about a mob hitman about to give you two in the back of the head with the Silence 22. It's nothing personal, it's just business. He knew they wanted him dead, and he tried to do it, but he was stopped. And then he went into the hospital, and after some weeks began to respond to therapy, develop his will to live again, and that's when it became necessary to end his life for him. And the circumstances surrounding his going out that window are by turns tragic, infuriating, fascinating, heartbreaking, and enraging.
Interesting. We're going to take calls if anyone would like to call in, and that number is 85KGRA Live or 855-472-5483. That number's up on the screen if you're watching YouTube. So were there people right away that were saying that there's more to this than just someone jumping out the window?
Yes. Forrestal's brother and a number of very close friends maintained from the beginning that he had been murdered by very powerful people in the American government at the time. But they, and again, Forrestal's brother was no crazy man or conspiracist. He was able to put the pieces together, as were people close to him. In the early 60s, 63, 64, a scholar at the University of California, Dr. Arnold Rogo, a professor of history, wrote a very compelling book, a kind of psychiatric profile of Forrestal. And he actually interviewed Truman and the doctors who had worked with him at the hospital, Lovett, the people who were closest to him. And in the book, which is simply, a straight look at his life from that perspective, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, there are people who were close to Forrestal who are convinced that he was murdered. And then he goes on to set aside a very well-written paragraph about that being the possible case, and then goes on to never discuss it again in the book. But yes, there were people close to him who were convinced that he was murdered from the day he went out that window.
There's also the story of the Monsignor who was trying to get to see him, and Forrestal was trying to see him too, his priest. And the morning that it was announced that he died, an orderly ran up to him in the lobby of the hospital where they were making announcements about his death. And the orderly whispered in Monsignor's ear, "You know that he was murdered, don't you?" And then disappears.
Well,
this is also captured in the
words
film.
to that effect for sure. And Jennifer's right on the money. Monsignor Maurice J. Sheehy was a very well-liked and very influential Catholic priest who ministered to some of the most powerful and best-known elected officials who happened to be Catholic. And the first call that Secretary Forrestal made from Bethesda Naval Facility, once he had permission to use the phone, was to Sheehy. And the gist of the call, as Sheehy recalled later in life, was as a Catholic, he had strayed from the faith, and I think that's putting it mildly, and wanted the Monsignor's help in helping him to reconnect with his Catholicism. Needless to say, this became a priority for the Monsignor. This man had served his country in so many ways and was so popular with the American public. And that afternoon, he made his first appointment to visit him. Between that call and that brief exchange, that moment in the lobby of the hospital the morning he went out the window, the Monsignor had come to the hospital, made appointments to see Forrestal, I think 6 separate times. And each time was told, he's sleeping, he's in therapy, he can't see you now. And ultimately, I think 2 days before the murder, he was seen by the Secretary of Navy. And my sense is he blew his top at him. And the Secretary of Navy made the call to the head of Bethesda, was assured that the Monsignor would see him, and soon, but obviously not soon enough.
Interesting. We have someone calling in, so as soon as that screen, we'll take that call. But so I find it interesting that his brother felt that way, but also, if I recall, we have a few people calling in, so we'll be taking those calls in just a minute. But didn't he feel, or this could have been part of paranoia, of course, but didn't he feel that people were following him?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
The last few weeks of his life, he was exhibiting, actually the last days before he was institutionalized, primarily from the account of one of his house servants, that he was doubly concerned with people being on the property, with recording devices in the walls. The Navy checked it out, assured him that that wasn't the case, that his line wasn't tapped. He called J. Edgar Hoover, who was not at the office at the time, did not call back after Hoover returned the call. But yes, I'm reminded, though, of the great old phrase, you don't have to be a paranoid to know that somebody is following you.
Yeah.
There was obvious attention on him by people more and more concerned about his state, certainly. And then it all, really spiraled out of control for him.
Wow. Okay. Well, we have Stephen, and he's calling from Washington. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. How you doing?
Is
Hi,
it
Steve.
Washington, D.C. or Washington State?
Washington State.
Welcome to the show. You have a question for one of our guests?
I do. There's something I've always wondered how they reconcile this. So if Forrestal cracked and committed suicide, how is it they came to name an aircraft carrier after him? And one of the person in the chat said it wasn't just an aircraft carrier. It was a whole class of boats.
That's right.
Were named after him.
Well,
And I
think
was just curious how they could say he cracked up and committed suicide if they were going to name all the boats after him. Well,
having a nervous breakdown is no reflection on one's character, and Mr. Forrestal had served his country as Undersecretary of the Navy, as Secretary of Navy in wartime, and as the head of the Department of Defense. He was a Navy man when he was young, so it was more than appropriate to consider naming the very first nuclear aircraft carrier after him. For that matter, even though he never graduated from Princeton University, he attended Princeton and left 3 weeks before he was supposed to graduate to join the Navy, to become a flyer in World War I. But the war ended before he was able to enter the service. So Princeton named a campus after him. There's a shopping center named after him in New Jersey, a award in the Defense Department named after him. But these things, unless you have a relative in the Navy or work in the intelligence community or attended Princeton University, he has literally been written out of American history. But I understand your question, but the fact is, going into a mental state or having a nervous breakdown is, again, not a reflection on one's character. And the people who decided to name that carrier after him, as far as I'm concerned, could not have made a better choice.
Thank you for the call,
okay,
Stephen.
I was just curious. I mean, that seems like a PR disaster if something were to go wrong. So,
well, I think
anyway,
in my opinion, this is just my opinion, but perhaps he made more of a mark in his life than he did with his death, and I think that's what they're remembering him for.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Stephen, thanks a lot. Now we have another caller, and that is Jim. He's calling from Ventura, Ventura County, that is, California. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thanks, Martin. Great show. So, no doubt that Mr. Forrestal was privy to a lot of information. I'm curious why somebody who is so high profile and who was under a 24-hour watch had the time or the ability to throw themselves out a window.
Well, again, in the documentary, we go moment by moment through the circumstances. Again, nothing about that makes sense in terms of his hospital records, the accounts of everybody that spent time with him at the Bethesda Naval Facility, the fact that he was very much looking forward to leaving the facility that following morning. And then part of the official announcement was that he had gone into a profound suicidal state of depression, as sometimes happens with people who otherwise seem that they're, coming out of the problem that got them into a facility. I can only say I think your questions will be answered if you have an opportunity to see the documentary.
I'll definitely be seeing the documentary. You can count on that. But what I'm alluding to is I believe that he had a regular person assigned to him to watch him.
He had
and
three.
For some reason, that person was gone.
Yes, we addressed that slightly before. There were actually 3 Marines assigned to guard his physical door in 3 8-hour shifts every day. One of them, the one who allegedly was drunk that night and didn't show up for work the night that he went out the window, which I think is an insult to that individual and completely incorrect, was replaced that evening by a hospital orderly who had no contact with the secretary before that, had no background to work the situation, and who allegedly forgot to lock the door after he looked in on him at 1:45 in the morning. It's all a little eye-rolling in terms of the official timeline and rationale.
And there's evidence of a struggle that took place in the room.
Yeah, that's another thing.
We bring that up. Peter addresses that very well, and we cover that clearly in the film as well.
Broken
and also
glass.
his neck, the belt around his neck, supposedly was never tied around the
radiator
which
window.
he supposedly was hanging himself from, but there's no evidence that he actually tied it around the radiator. He just tied it around his neck. And then, of course, his handprints all over the window. There's lots of details that don't add up when you really read some of the newspaper articles in which Peter shares with you in the film.
Well, they certainly add up, but they don't add up to the official rationale.
You could probably share a file with the James Mcdonald suicide.
Yes and no. Mcdonald has been a hero of mine for decades, Jim. And for anybody that doesn't know who Dr. James Mcdonald is, one of the most courageous and impacting scientists who made an attempt, a superhuman attempt, to try to bring ufology into the world of official science. He was a brilliant atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona, who became very interested in the subject of UFOs and ultimately the cover-up. He did die a suicide, but one that I'm convinced the depression, the deep depression that led him to it, was exacerbated by the countless attacks by Philip Klass, who is no longer alive to potentially be ashamed of himself for helping drive a good man to end his life after he saw his career destroyed. But allegorically, at least, I think you're spot on, James. Both of these men, on a certain sense, were martyrs to the cause.
Thanks for the call, Jim.
Thank you both.
All right. So the lines are open. If anyone else wants to call in, that number again is 855-472-5483. Would love to hear from someone over listening at KGRA over there. These people are coming in from the YouTube, so would love to hear from someone over there if you want to call in. As far as going back to, I don't want to harp on MJ12, but MJ12 is one of the things I'd have a question on. Has anyone tried to get Freedom of Information Act documents? Because I would think that all the time that has passed, there should be some information that would be unclassified at this point for that, as well as James Forrestal. But
I don't know. The people to ask, and I think they'd be wonderful guests for you, are Bob and Ryan Wood, extraordinary father and son.
That worked with Stan?
Very closely on and off over the years.
Yeah.
Bob Wood was head of research and development at McDonnell Douglas, as I recall, with every security clearance imaginable. His son inherited his interest in this subject, and Ryan was responsible some years ago for producing a brilliant series of conferences called the Crash Retrieval Conferences, which were held annually for 7 years in Las Vegas, Nevada. It was not a conference that necessarily called on speakers like myself to address the crash retrieval subjects, but that was the title of the conference. But they went on to become, for me, the most immersed scholars in the MJ12 story, which they are a lot more familiar with, knowledgeable about. I don't know whether Stan, maybe Kathy might know, Jen, ever instituted any FOIAs specifically regarding MJ12. Again, in the very narrow focus that I have of this one document of 8 pages and the accompanying letter where Truman essentially sends Forrestal on his mission, in so many words, to find out what's going on. We do know that that day that the letter is dated, that President Truman met in his office with Forrestal and Dr. Vannevar Bush of the Research and Development Board, and it was the only entry in the White House log for 6 months on either side, where the president met with only those two men, MJ1 and MJ2, I think. And not only that, but there is no indication of the subject that they spoke of. Highly unusual. So for me, again, it's not just one dramatic fact or event. It's doing what good investigators try to do, triangulating, building a case, different evidences backing each other up, photographic evidence coinciding with documentary evidence, coinciding with witness testimony, coinciding with written accounts of the time, with interviews supporting the X number point of view. That's the case. That's how one builds a case and does one's best to present it to the public. And, our viewers will be the judge. One thing we will make sure of, Martin, is sometime in the next few days, Jennifer or I or Bob will get a link to you so that between now and your next show, at least, you will have an opportunity to watch the documentary in full. And if anybody is interested in follow-up or has questions for you about it, you'll be a lot better versed on, what we're talking around here tonight.
Sure, and I could actually, I could actually keep that in the show notes, whatever, if there's anything active on that. I'd be glad to. We're having a technical problem here with the, I'm trying to figure it out, with the phone screening page. It signed me out all by itself, and it's not letting me sign back in. So I think we may have to skip calls for the night. So if anyone in chat has questions, you're welcome to post them up. I'll try to take a look over there. There's a lot of people talking about MJ12. I see in the chat room. Someone posted a few minutes ago that they thought that the FBI said it was a hoax, but of course we don't always typically believe everything the FBI might say or any part of any intelligence agency. As far as I'm concerned, we don't really know. Go ahead. You look like you're going to say something, Jennifer.
Yes. Well, I wanted to add something that Peter didn't really discuss, but I think it's a critical turning point in the Forrestal story. At least it was for me, in my understanding, because you look at the data and you try to say, well, what was it that really triggered this onslaught of, self-doubt and depression and confusion and suicidal behavior? If I'm not correct, Forrestal suggested to the president that he might prepare some briefing documents for the next administration, because it looked very well like Dewey may have been elected over Truman in an election that was coming up. And he suggested that we better prepare and get the next administration on board for understanding how to deal with the situation that they were dealing with. And I think it's at that point that Forrestal was attacked and told, absolutely not, this stays within our administration, this stays within MJ12.
You're very close, Jen. In fact, right on the money. Forrestal had suggested to Robert Lovett, a protege and future Secretary of Defense, that because it did look very much like Governor Dewey of New York was going to carry the election for the Republicans, that might it not make sense for somebody from Truman's inner circle to interface with somebody from Dewey's. Now, it's important to know that this is now de rigueur. This is the way, one of the things Americans should be proud of. We have never had a violent change of government. Teams work together when there is a change in power, and it's always done peacefully. But in 1949, this was not the way it was. And simply the suggestion that we do something to work with this candidate who might succeed Truman was spun by a number of individuals very close to Truman who were, when all is said and done, I think jealous of the closeness that Truman had developed with Forrestal and of his tremendous admiration for Forrestal because of his fine work over the years. And the sad the saddest aspect here is that Truman bought it and believed that Forrestal had acted in a disloyal way. For a man who I think literally would have given up his life for either President Roosevelt or Truman, and certainly was as devoted a team member as any president of the United States has ever had, I think this must have been not just dispiriting, but heartbreaking, and a cause for tremendous self-doubt for Forrestal, who,
And as I understand, and this may just be my speculation, Peter, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, I am sort of with the understanding that Forrestal might have thought this might not be something we want to necessarily keep secret, because it's going to create a lot of problems down the road if we do keep it secret. And everyone else in his group, whether it was the administration or MJ-12, were in the opinion that they didn't know enough yet, and when they absolutely had to keep it secret. And I think it was when Truman was going out of office, didn't he give or was Eisenhower? When Eisenhower was going out of office, he gave a very compelling talk as his final, address to the nation.
Beware of the military-industrial complex.
Beware.
Oh, yes.
Beware.
Yeah.
So these things are all connected. They're not separate.
I think that's a very good observation, Jennifer, and one that may well be true.
Yeah. I know that speech is still holds very strong today, doesn't it? From back then.
If only we had listened.
Yeah.
So Forrestal might have been trying to digest all of this himself inside his own head. How are we going to go forward? What are we really dealing with? And of course, there's this alleged story that was captured in Paul Davis's film. We don't know whether it's true or not, but if an alien being survived the Roswell crash and was held in an underground facility, and members of the elite, military went to see this being, it is a supposed or an alleged story that the alien started communicating directly with Forrestal and sort of overtook his mind and downloaded information to him and gave him warnings. This may have also been part of that, but that's, of course, not something we cover because it's not clearly documented. There isn't a piece of smoking gun evidence, and Peter wanted to stay right with the facts.
Yeah.
He didn't,
Good choice.
Anything that's in this, you can go and dig up in an archive yourself or find in a newspaper article. So
we only have about 1 minute, just to let you know, and so I can't believe this show has come to a close so quickly. And so you said in about a few weeks or so, was it you, Peter, that was saying that this film should be available basically online, and where would someone find it?
Yeah, at the beginning, certainly to start, in the next week or two, I expect, it will be up on the On Wings Productions.
Well, there is a page up now, so that anyone can go to On Wings Productions. That's my website. So it's ONWINGES. It's the name of my production company. So you can go there and look under projects that I've done. And there's a page for the James Forrestal Project. So they can read about it. They can learn how to buy a DVD there. It's to contact Peter Robbins, and they're $20, including shipping. And, it's Peter's email is there. Or Peter can just give his email right now.
I think we actually have it on your long bio, I believe, in the show notes. So anyone can go there and get it there. But thank you. Go ahead.
At some point after that, it will be available on Amazon or another major platform.
Right.
Got it. Absolutely had a wonderful time. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martin.
Great seeing you.
All right, great seeing you too. All right, everyone. So that is it for us, and we will be back next week. We have another interesting show. We have Kathy Martin on for the first hour. She's going to be talking about her new book. Then we have Stacy Wright and Marianne Robb. They're going to be on from the Phoenix MUFON. I met them out there. They're both really nice people, and it should be a lot of fun. And I want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. I want to thank you, the listener, and the supporters. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.